Hi, I'm Pidot. Welcome to Old Bull TV, your insider's guide to political prediction markets. My wife has given me a very serviceable haircut, so we're ready for another quarantine roundtable. And this time we're doing something a little different. Rather than putting together another panel of traders looking at the price action in the prediction markets, we've assembled an elite squad of international futurists and decision scientists, and we're asking them to gaze into the post-coronavirus future to tell us what life might look like on the other side of all this. Will our economy, our democracy, our favorite sports teams ever go back to normal? And should they? Well, these folks might just have the answers. So let's ask them. Let's shoot the bull. So let's turn now to our panel of futurists and forecasters. Joining me today are Dr. Pavel Atanasov, former postdoctoral fellow for the Good Judgment Project and founder of Pidot, which we'll be asking him about. Jordi Serra, deputy director at Center for Postnormal Policy and Future Studies in Barcelona, and Brett Specter, certified super forecaster and an American entrepreneur currently also working in Spain. So with two in New York and two in Spain, today's roundtable is coming to you from two of the world's hottest COVID hotspots. And hopefully this group of forward thinkers can help us to develop some kind of view of how things are going to look once things have cooled down. So since each of you is joining us for the first time, let's begin by letting viewers know a little bit more about you and your work. Pavel, can you tell us a little about Pidot?
Yeah, so I co-founded Pidot with Regina Joseph, who is another Good Judgment Project super forecaster. And we have been working on research and development that has to do with decision science and forecasting, basically coming up with new crowdsourcing methodologies and ways to make people better at forecasting. So I have done less of the forecasting myself, but I have spent a lot of time tracking other people's forecasts, learning about where they get things right and where they get things wrong, looking for biases, and finding out ways in which we can use other people's insights to put them together, to aggregate them, and to predict the future in that way.
Fascinating. Jordi, can we move to you for just a minute? And can you tell us what is post-normal policy?
Well, post-normal policy, it's a part of our theory, which is the post-normal times theory. We are all futurists. At some point, we were feeling that somehow our work was not good enough. We started thinking how we could improve it. We thought initially that the problem was us. At some point, we realized that maybe the thing was that we were looking at reality the wrong way. Maybe there was a new kind of reality, what we call post-normal times, that doesn't seem to comply very well with the old times forecasting of future studies. So we tried to develop a new way to understand change in present time. And of course, since we were all futurists, we also tried to find ways how we can, let's say, navigate or implement change in this time. Therefore, policymaking.
Makes sense. And this is obviously such an important field of study and research currently, as none of us know what to expect from the emerging post-normal. And that's why we're so glad to have you here today. And finally, Brett, can you tell us what is a super forecaster? How does one become a certified super forecaster?
Well, to stay, I was elevated to super forecaster with the Good Judgment Project in the second year, and I stayed at that status for the full 4 years. And since then, I've been forecasting professionally with Good Judgment when they became a commercial spin-off of the original project. To stay certified, you have to answer a minimum amount of questions, and you have to keep your what's called a Brier score below a certain point. And that's it. So compared to your other two gentlemen here, I'm just a lowly forecaster, but I enjoy it, and I seem to be good at it. And on the side, I also get together with other forecasters and do a little forecasting on the stock market and different things like options. Keeps me involved.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again, all of you, for joining us, and appreciate the brief intro so our viewers have a sense of who they're listening to. So let's jump into it. I want to start with kind of the big question I think that everyone's sort of trying to figure out. from civilians to heads of state all around the world, which is when will things go back to normal? And I think we're all kind of beginning to get that creeping sense that things might not go back to normal, or at least what we think of as normal. So, we'll eventually emerge from our homes and go back to work and go back to school. And yet the world that we find ourselves in may look quite a bit different, at least in some regards. So let's start off by comparing the before and after of this pandemic to, major global upheavals of the last, say, century that remade major parts of society and economy, whether 9/11 attacks, World War, Depression. Where does this fit on that spectrum of kind of the fundamental reordering of society?
I think that you would have to get very country specific for that, depending on where you were in the Depression or after World War II. The baseline is going to be quite different from what you expect as normal. And I think the politics of each place is going to be like that as well. What you thought was normal before and what should be normal afterwards is going to depend where you were before all this happened. So I think you need to get more specific when you're asking about, if you're asking about America, that's one thing. If you're asking about Spain, that's something else. I think it helps to be more specific in those kind of questions. Sure.
Well, what specific things are you expecting will be sort of the most tangible as we, open the doors and crawl back out into the sunshine? Are things going to, by and large, look pretty normal, or is it going to be such a stepwise, measured reopening of society that things are going to seem a little quiet and lonely for a while?
Can I go back to your first question?
Sure, Jordi, go ahead.
Okay, a couple of comments, previous questions about normal. The thing is that whatever comes next, it's going to be normal, because the way we operate, we tend to normalize everything incredibly fast. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing to begin with. But then again, normal, when talking about future-related issues like are we doing now, it's a rather toxic concept, because normal is what got us into this mess to begin with. We have normalized so many odd things, and now we are just reaping what we sow. So, and excuse me for cursing, but I am one of those, so fuck normal. Let's come up with something new. At the center, we are using the idea of transnormality because we don't like new normal as well. And this transnormality should be something that all of us should have some saying in it. Maybe there are things of what we are experiencing that we don't like and we want to change, but maybe other things we need to keep them, and maybe we need to come with new ideas. The point is that if we are right about the post-normal nature of the current situation, it's not very right or totally right to compare it to past crises, because the speed, the scope, the scale, and the simultaneity we are experiencing now is unprecedented. So there are parts of the current crisis we can't rely on experience, on, let's say, accumulated knowledge. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that some of the things we are experiencing are new. We are very ignorant about them. We need to humble ourselves and approach them with a different situation. Forget about normal. It's just a romantic notion. We will never go back to what we were, nor we should.
Mm-hmm. Pavel, what do you think?
Yes, so I think that there are two perspectives here. One is of the sort of the policymaker or the person who wants to shape reality and sees this as an opportunity, as a window for changing how we're doing things, right? So if you're a political leader or if you work in the field that Jordi works in, this is a big part of it. And then there's sort of the observer or predictor, which is Jordi obviously works on that as well. But there are two different parts, and I'm thinking more in terms of just purely predicting rather than trying to shape what will happen. And I do see by looking at many forecasts over time that we tend to over-predict change and under-predict or underappreciate the power of the gravity of the status quo. So there have been many tweets about like how things will be radically changed, everything will change, and then when you ask the person, you know, let's say someone would say, we'll go towards homeschooling. And then when you ask the person like how big the change would be, they'll say, well, we'll go from like 3% to 4%. And when you say that, it doesn't sound like such a radical change. So some of the status quo, as bad as it is, has a way of creeping back and asserting its gravity. And so I think a lot of the changes that we are thinking about and predicting in the middle of this crisis will probably be much more gradual than we're experiencing right now. I mean, this was a sudden shock. We're all staying at home, you know, we're not going to work. But you know, when things get back over the next weeks or months, some people are going to, you know, remember that, you know, the old reality is, in a way, it's good. It's good not to be at home all the time, and some people would want to go back to some sort of status quo that was before that. So I think the changes would be maybe big long-term changes, but on the medium term over the next few years, a lot of people would want to go back to what they had a few months back.
Brett, you suggested we get a little more. Sorry, who's that? Jordi?
Yeah. I think he has a point. I mean, the pull of the, let's say, old reality is very strong. So the possibility of some pendulum movement and the desire to go back very fast, it's undeniable. Then the question is how much of the need situation will stand or not. But we will see anyway.
Yeah, I think that people crave familiarity, and the longer, I mean, we're into a month into this lockdown now in Spain, and the longer that goes on, the more people are going, oh, please can't I just get back to my old life? Right. Then that's normal. That's normal. But as Jordi was saying, I think if we come into a different reality where there's not jobs out there again, people are going to start asking questions of why is it like this? Why is my life different than it was? What happened? You know, what can I do to change that? And that's when the beginning of the conversation happens. You'd hope that policymakers are thinking about this now, but there's no guarantee of that. You know, they often react at the moment as well, which I think has become all too obvious from this crisis is people are making a lot of decisions on the fly, and it shows.
Let's talk a little bit about the geopolitical changes, potentially some of the more shorter term impact of this, electoral impact and other changes in political structures. You know, we've seen some interesting movement in Hungary, for instance, which has gone quite suddenly from a democracy to something looking more like a temporary dictatorship almost overnight. In the U.S., we have a sort of an ongoing debate over federalism versus a strong central government. And in times of crisis, in times of emergency, we certainly saw this post 9/11, the populace tends to be a little bit more comfortable with ceding some authority and some of their privacy and other liberties to a stronger centralized executive branch. Do you think we're more likely to see Hungary-style reactions in the U.S.? We're more likely to see some of that power that's distributed among the states re-centralized at the federal level, and curious if any of you have insights into how this may swing the balance at all for the 2020 elections in the U.S. Obviously, our show often looks at prediction markets, political prediction markets, trying to guess the outcomes of elections. Do you think this has any meaningful impact one way or another in 2020 elections?
I mean, I think if you're talking about Hungary, that's been happening for a long time. They've been heading in that direction for at least 10 years now. So that's not a surprise. This is just more of a consolidation of power than it was before. I think more of an interesting comparison, at least for Europe, is comparing why Hungary is sort of getting a buy from the EU in this and why Poland isn't. Poland is doing the same thing, but they're really getting some backlash from the EU about what they're trying to do. And that's more, you have to question why is that the case?
Do you have a theory?
Not a good one. Not a good. The only thing I can say is that I think that the leaders in Hungary probably do have more popular support, and it's more evenly split in Poland. So that's the only thing I could say at the moment. But Poland goes back and forth between authoritarianism and sort of liberalism, whereas Hungary, this has been a progressive thing for the last decade. So maybe that's the difference there.
And how about on this kind of spectrum between open trade, liberalized trade policy, and kind of the more protectionist, nationalist, the trajectory that we've been on somewhat more in the U.S. in these last few years under the Trump administration. But now, if you add in things like border security or isolating supply lines and things like that, perhaps under the color of medical security, healthcare security, but perhaps at least in some cases to an advance, pre-existing and unrelated to healthcare agenda. Do you think that's the kind of thing where we may see large economies become less integrated, become more segregated, and possibly with additional economic knock-on effects, from that?
It depends. In my mind, it depends on how overwhelmed, let's say, the U.S. healthcare system becomes. Right now, we're at the point where we thought it would be really overcome with patients, especially in places like New York City, but things are starting to get a little better. So if we see a lot of deaths because people couldn't get ventilators or doctors couldn't get PPE, rather than just the threat of it, but if it see it actually happening, then usually after a flood, people buy flood insurance, right? So after this, people are going to start saying, yeah, we need to be making more ventilator and more PPE at home and not rely on other people. But the lessons people learn are generally very specific. And, it may be that for the next crisis, we'll need different things. And those lessons probably wouldn't have helped for the next crisis. But in terms of nationalism, it seems like they're part of it for the U.S. is administration specific, whether there's a Democrat or Trump in the White House. But there seems to be a sort of an anti-China sentiment that even some independents and Democrats have also changed their minds over the last few years on that. So that might be, so that sentiment, however unjustified I think it is, would be there, and I think China would in part be blamed over being the starting place where the coronavirus came from, and that would shape sentiment. I'm not sure if it would shape policy, but there'll be definitely strong voices among the populace who go from the coronavirus started from China to we should be more hawkish on trade policy with them. I think there has been that.
And now, if more and more data comes out showing that China was sort of concealing to a greater extent the spread and timing of the outbreak, possibly to the detriment of the policy decisions being made by other countries, and certainly if the origins of the virus turn out to be other than from the wet market, let's say, could revelations like that sort of qualitatively change that balance in terms of if there's a broad consensus among nations that China's bad acts here led to preventable deaths outside of China? How destabilizing do you think that could be in terms of the sort of the global policy reaction to that? That's for anyone.
I don't know about this, let's say, origin of the virus, because right now there are so many theories running. The point is that what China did let's say, from January on, gave us time to the rest of country, and most countries didn't use it. Actually, some of them wasted. Spain, for instance. So I think that it is important to focus on these more, let's say, punctual or conjunction events, but it's also important to look at the longer trends. So, for instance, your point about democracies becoming more authoritative, this has been happening for, as my colleague Brett was saying, for more than a decade. So democracy is in decline in many places, in Spain as well. So the seduction of, let's say, simple, compelling messages in these times of uncertainty has grown. So look at the average leaders all over the world, and they have becoming, let's say, focusing their messages in slogans type lines: make America great again, get Brexit done, Spanish first, this kind of thing, which is really not very useful, but because so many uncertain things happening, becomes appealing. So now many leaders are betting that if they are showing some sort of a strong, determined leadership, they will reinforce their power base. So far, those that are being more honest and more open seem to do better. And I'm thinking of people like Trudeau in Canada or even Merkel in Germany. So I think that in the case of the United States, it depends on the long-term memory of the American voters. So the fact that there have been all sorts of attempts to prevent America from getting a true health system, and depending on the death counts they get at the end, that may be an important issue. Right now in Spain, the official death toll is more than 15,000 dead people, but in some places the death rate has grown over 70% regarding March last year. So probably the figures are a lot higher. How this will affect Pedro Sánchez next election? Well, it should affect him, because in some cases, I think leaders should be accountable for bad decisions. Just blaming China, well, it may work for a short term, but if I suspect there are longer trends, working here, it will be food for today and hunger for tomorrow.
Yeah, in the U.S., sorry, Brett, go ahead.
No, I just think again, it's human nature for especially for politicians to look for scapegoats, and China is just such an obvious one. I personally think that supply chains will be affected. I think people will change how they won't be so dependent. It gets to that point though, down a few years from now, where there's just something being cheap win out over a supply chain. But in the shorter term, I think people are willing to sort of pay that extra price even if it's just words, if they're given more assurance that, okay, we've got a better supply chain, we're not dependent on China for, in America's example, for 80% of our pharmaceutical needs. That's going to resonate, and I think both Republicans and Democrats are going to harp on that for this election, no doubt.
Let me add something. I think that another important element here is the contradictory and paradoxical nature of the current crisis. So probably we could agree that the existence of these globalizing trends has made it easier for the virus to spread very fast. So now it would be a good moment for local production, local retail, local trade to bloom, but yet they are suffering the most because they lack the structure, for instance, to deliver at home. So Amazons and the likes are doing far better despite they're still using these global trends. So you see, the point is that things that work or have a reason at some level or at some term may have a serious backlash at the longer term. So if really we need to, let's say, reduce this social distancing slower than some people are saying, for instance, the cities I live with that are created for people to be on the street, we need to do some structural changes. Maybe in time we can go back, but if we need to adopt some longer term measures regarding how we deal with each other, some of these things will have to be considered. Not now, because right now we are still trying to save people and avoiding the economy to collapse totally. But sooner or later, we need to rethink these, I would say, more structural trends or realities.
Mm-hmm.
Let's look out, say, a year and shifting gears a little bit, but to something that is sort of a barometer for a lot of people in terms of their sort of day-to-day normalcy. What do you think sports look like? We've had the Olympics pushed back a year, presumably, and hopefully that will be able to go ahead as rescheduled. But you've got virtually every professional sports league is sort of just canceled itself, at least for the current season. Major League Baseball is talking about maybe having all their games in Arizona with no fans. UFC is talking about going to tribal land to where the guidelines are not enforced or less enforced to have some of their bouts. That's sort of the ultimate antithesis to social distancing, right? Putting 50, 100,000 people in one building all together, all to, cough on each other and, brush shoulders as they pass by. Assuming sports get back off the ground, say after one season of pause, are people going to go? I mean, are they going to go in big enough numbers that it makes sense given this sort of now well-established economic model of professional sports that leagues won't fold, or that at least a large number of teams won't fold, or at least that the sports business won't look radically different for foreseeable future?
If they don't go in person, I would have thought that they'll still pay to see sports. At times I've been in Asia, the Premier League, the English Premier League is hugely popular over there. They're never going to get over to England to see a game, and it doesn't matter. They've all got their favorites. It's funny, you go to a place like Vietnam and you wouldn't necessarily expect to see Manchester United and Liverpool banners all over the place, but you do. And I think it's a relatively small percentage of people that go to the live games anyway. I haven't seen the numbers, but it would seem like that. But if people are playing, I'm sure people will pay to see them one way or the other.
If I was a stadium, or if I was like a club owner, I would start cautiously by sitting people like a few seats away from each other first, on an experimental basis. And if there's just currently no epidemic, no new cases, then you can try to fill out the stadium. And I think there's a real hunger for people that, people are now watching games from 20 years ago because they like sports, and there's nothing new. So I think that the people who are used to it and have done it for many years would go back. It might be a slightly different clientele, maybe slightly younger, or people who already have immunity. So there may be some self-selection of who goes, but for most of the biggest clubs, there'll be plenty of takers. There'll be plenty of people going to games in a year's time if the pandemic is just over and there are no new cases.
I agree.
Let's talk about. Yeah.
Sorry. You want
Go
to
ahead.
move on? Okay.
No, please.
I totally agree. Hell, I even would go to watch a game right now. It's my 26th day in confinement. But I think that we are learning that maybe we have to be flexible and adopt multiple strategies. So most likely sports, but also culture will be the most heavily heated sectors right now, because it seems unlikely that it's going to be possible to have big concerts, big plays, or big games soon. That may not be a big problem for Manchester United, Barcelona, Real Madrid, or the likes, because they have a global audience. But this is a major disaster for the smaller teams, for the smaller companies. So right now, what we are seeing is many of them are trying to do things online. They are doing it for free because they want to cheer us up, to keep the spirit. So maybe the other thing is that if this part of this digital interaction we are doing right now stands, we also need to rethink our consumption models. So we need to understand that doesn't matter if it's through internet, we have to pay for culture, we have to pay for entertainment, we have to pay for sports. There will be chance that we'll really like to be with others because that sense of communion you get in these shared events. But if we cannot, let me put it this way. The last 2 weeks, this is the 5th interview I'm participating. Tomorrow I have a global foresight. I'm interacting more in these last 2 weeks than in the previous 2 months. So, and I miss physically meeting and go and have a beer with my friends, but this is also opening opportunities. The way I'm doing my courses, my classes right now, there are parts of this teaching experience that I don't want to lose. I miss meeting with my students, but this is also a shocking way to show us that things can be done in different ways. So all I'm saying, I agree totally with Pavel. There will be a big push to go back to normal, but we need to realize that there are some parts of this current experience that we may like to keep. My God, it's so wonderful to be in a silent city. I can hear the birds after years. Bats are coming back. So they probably have to go away after this. But maybe this part of this digital community that we are building right now can be developed, can be strengthened. This can be even an opportunity for many economic activities that may suffer a lot of this and the post-pandemic treatment. So I think it's a very good examples that crises are major shakes, but also opportunities.
Right. Jordi, I'm so glad you brought that up too, because it's counterintuitive, but I think real. And I think a lot of people are seeing it, that in some ways, the degree to which that this has increased certain modes and opportunities for interpersonal connection, whereas the defining kind of hallmark of the crisis obviously is the total separation and relative isolation. And yet, just as an example, later today, I'm hosting a happy hour for my business school class. Most folks I haven't seen, and we graduated almost 20 years ago. So I think we have around 100 people that I don't ever see. But this sort of notion of the online Zoom cocktail party is sort of taken off. And so we decided to put this together. And it's going to be a great opportunity to reconnect with people that I almost assuredly would not have otherwise. So I think that's an important point to keep in mind, that to some in some capacity, in some ways, there are opportunities here to increase the degree to which we're interconnected. As you mentioned, whether it's in schooling, whether it's in the way we consume entertainment, TV, movies, sports. Some of these things are just sort of vestigial. You had to have big stadiums, because how else are you going to get a lot of people to watch a live sporting event? There's no live broadcasting. There's no internet. Now there is, so you don't necessarily have to be there, but we're going to, I guess, find out which of those things, which of those community-based things are important to us and not just vestigial. Do we want to be in a stadium with 50,000 other people because you want the roar of the crowd and you want to smell the hot dogs and you want to hear the crack of the bat? Or do we figure, no, I'm happy to just, pay $10 for a, pay-per-view or a subscription to the channel that brings me that in the comfort of my own home. And that's to be determined. Movie theaters, bars, nightclubs, some of these experiences aren't ones that can be recreated, at least not fully remotely. Others are. And we'll see what that kind of reordering looks like. It might take months, might take years, but this will certainly be catalyzing for a number of those industries undergoing that kind of seismic shift.
I mean, it's an interesting thought of which, let's say, entertainment industries might do better to enhance that experience. So if we all have earphones on, or maybe even some kind of virtual reality, and we're sharing this together, does that sort of replace, or does that come into a new shared experience? I'm sure it's something that some companies are already looking at and working on.
I just learned today that the business in virtual sex is blooming.
Yeah.
No wonder.
In terms of the overall economic impact of this, and that's something that obviously the markets, investors, and central banks are all sort of trying to figure out, how dislocating, how durably dislocating do you think it is to pause the world effectively, to pause the economic engines of the world, and to a certain extent, central governments, central banks can help shore it up for a time and guarantee payrolls and things like that. But when the world gets switched back on, or slowly switched back on, for how long and how deeply do you expect we'll feel those dislocating effects? Are we talking about Great Depression? Are we talking about a V-shaped recession? What's your sense?
It seems like we're beyond the point of like a complete V-shaped recession, at least in the U.S. But in general, U.S. is good at plunging deep and getting, a lot of people get fired, but then they get rehired relatively soon after the recession is over. So it's a matter of maybe months or a couple of years for something like this. But in Europe, a lot of the emphasis is on keeping jobs rather than creating jobs or getting them back on. And so as a result, things get a little bit slower. And also, I'll be interested to hear what the case is in Spain. But the U.S. has basically unlimited lending opportunities, right? The U.S. government can borrow $2 or $3 or $4 trillion and put them into the economy. For places like Spain that recently have gone through a credit crisis in the last 10 years, that may not be the case. And so in a place like the US, there's a lot of things going on for the next few months or years. But in some places in Europe, especially that already have debt and the investors are not too willing to lend to them at a low interest rate, that may be a bigger shock longer term.
I think at least in Spain, it's going to be very bad. I think we are talking of a country that it's almost already right now bankrupt. So national debt is at this point probably bigger than 100 Spanish GDP. On top of that, I see a true lack of courage to do things that should be done. So right now, measures like the one done in the USA to put money in people's pocket, that could help, because a lot of people are suffering a lot, not because of what is happening right now, because it's so new that even if they have lost the job, they still can manage. But in a month or two, no unemployment salary, no jobs, no prospects. And that's a tragedy. I agree with Pavel. I think that in this regard, although I think that the United States is doing other things wrong, in this regard, they are doing better. Canada is following a similar approach. I think this only signals the failure of the European Union. So the European Union is becoming a failed project because if you look at what is happening, all the discredit regarding political issues, the thing you guys were saying about Poland versus Hungary, the way they are treating refugees, the shameful, absolutely obscene treatment of refugees in Greece or in the border in Turkey, well, what has been happening here in Catalonia, many other things. So the economy was the only thing. And now that they have a real challenge, of course, some countries do not want to help Spain because they don't see it as a reliable partner. So then what is the purpose of the European Union? Because Spain cannot print money right now. So if European Union doesn't print money, so then we go. So I think that we need to think of how we can get out of this together, because it's going to be bad not only in Spain, many other countries. India, whatever may happen there is such a big question mark. Africa, South America, Venezuela, how is going to be? So I think that calls into question the basic economic principles. So if we have to choose about saving people or saving economy, I wonder if it's really worth to save an economy that doesn't put people at the center of its endeavors and purpose.
Yeah, this is the old problem coming back, the split in the EU. The consensus works when it works, but when it doesn't, then you get this north-south split. And I've lived in Spain for a few years now. I've also lived in the Netherlands, so I can see both sides of it. And yeah, the impression, I think I hope some of that old impression, at least as far as Spain goes, has gone now. I don't think the Northern Europeans see Spain as being some kind of not working hard enough, always enjoying themselves. If you look at Italy, though, the Italians work just as hard as anybody else, but their government is so incredibly dysfunctional. You've got this thing of what do you do about Italy? On the one hand, they don't deserve to crash and burn, and on the other hand, nobody trusts the Italian government, whoever that might be, to actually handle the money correctly. And so you get this freeze of nobody knows what to do, and that is a real problem right now. Whereas there's sort of, you talk about central governments. Central governments sometimes can make decisions, even though I'm like sort of against too much centralization personally, but central governments can sometimes make decisions that other, disparate power bases can't do. And yeah, that's a problem within Europe. And we'll see now if there is enough consensus for strong decisions, or if this is just going to keep limping along like it usually does.
Yeah, so a few years ago during the Greek debt crisis, that was like, top news let's say in the New York Times for days on end. Mm. Right now, if there's a Greek debt crisis, it won't even make it probably, it will make it to the bottom of the first page because there's so much going on. So we may be missing a lot of bad economic news, or at least the seed of bad economic news of sovereign debt crisis and, companies, teetering on the brink of collapse that is just not covered because we have our eyes on much bigger stories.
Yeah. No, that's an interesting point too. Yeah, where the entire world, obviously, quite literally, is focused on one problem, and it's obviously a very big problem. But just because there's a big problem doesn't mean other problems can't happen at the same time. You could have a huge Category 5 hurricane make landfall and displace millions of people. You could have war breakout over something unrelated. You could, as you said, you could have a debt crisis. You could have economic instability, and if no one's eyes are on that ball, it's hard to imagine the scale and scope of the potential fallout. We could go on these topics literally all day, but in respect of all of your time, I want to let you go. But one final thought, I guess, if you wouldn't mind sharing with us, what country? Of course, we have 150 some odd countries around the world all dealing with this in their own way. What country, if any, do you look to as kind of the model that seems to be approaching this the right way, maybe not making all the right choices, but seems to kind of have the right problem-solving framework in mind that you would advise other world leaders to look to?
To me, it's South Korea, right? It's hard to look up to Singapore because it's like a nation state. It's just like a city. But in terms of large nations, it seems that South Korea got ahead of it. They started testing right. And as a result, even though they had a lot of cases, they lost very few people. And, there may be a second wave, but it seems like they got ahead of the curve and they did a lot of things right to limit the damage, both in terms of, human lives and suffering, but also like economically.
And was the distinction mainly just starting earlier with the testing, the tracking, the treating, when it was a smaller problem that they could ultimately contain?
Absolutely. A few weeks makes a huge difference in this.
Jordi, what do you think?
I would agree very much with Pavel. I think that South Korea, Canada, Germany could be similar stories. I take his point not to go to microstates, but I want to bring your attention into Andorra, the microstate in the Pyrenees. Mm-hmm. They decided to follow the advice of experts. They have followed them to the letter. They have bought tests. Now they will be starting using the first antivirals that have proved successful. And as a result, they are doing very well despite being surrounded by very bad places. So even in this sense, Hong Kong or Taiwan could also fall into this pattern. So that connects with what Brett said, that I think that diversity in the treatment, it's also required because different places, different situation, and one size doesn't fit all.
I think recently I've been reading a lot about Georgia as well, Georgia the country.
Yeah.
And they've also had quite a lot of success about containment, and they acted very early. And again, I think as Jordi was saying, followed expert advice. And some of that expert advice was actually an American based, I don't know if it was a health center or something, but it was the Robert Lugar Institute, if you look it up. And this was somewhat controversial in Georgia, especially for the more pro-Russian part of the country. Since the crisis started, they've been following the advice of this institute, and they've really had a very low rate of both spread of infection and deaths. And it's kind of an interesting case to follow if you look it up. I think New Zealand also deserves some praise for what they've
New Zealand seems to have done well. And Singapore, as you mentioned, being a microstate and obviously pretty unique in terms of its governance mode. Maybe you can't draw too many conclusions, but it does seem to be, at least anecdotally, a lot of the island nations are having a little bit of an easier time for, easy to understand reasons, I suppose.
Well, because confinement is proving to be a successful strategy. Yeah. So even if you don't have a very robust health system, if you manage to keep the healthy people separate from the infected people, well, then you break the chain. Yes. And I mean, I think it was El Salvador or other countries in South America, they have opted for following severe confinement measures because they know once the virus gets in the country, there's little they can do. Look at Ecuador. I mean, terrible. It's a real tragedy. So I think that, for instance, the other day someone was saying something that really got me into thinking. We spend a lot of money in military, in weapons for extreme cases. We do hope not to have to use all these weapons, but we nevertheless spend money on them. And we do not spend even remotely equivalent amount of money into health systems. And when this really extraordinary situation come, then all the systems are on the very verge of collapse. So maybe one of the lessons we will learn is that we need to reassess our priorities, because despite the number of countries that are getting the army, you cannot shoot down a virus.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting analogy. And in this case, literally an ounce of prevention equals a pound of cure. Mm-hmm. Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you again all for your time very much. Brett Specter, Jordi Serra, and Pavel Atanasov. And Jordi, I want to give you a quick moment to offer a plug. You're giving a presentation for the Global Foresight Summit. I believe it's tomorrow, but would you tell our viewers a little bit about it and how to find it?
You have to go to globalforesightsummit.com. Mm-hmm. It has been already going on today. Tomorrow we have the second day, and Saturday the third day. And I will be talking about post-normal policymaking. I think the time is 10 a.m. Central European time. Mm-hmm. But you can go to the website. There's a large roster of speakers, far more interesting than me, and you can get all their times. And it's going to be cool. I mean, it's been very successful, and it reinforced my idea that we are finding new ways to build community.
No, it looks great. I encourage everyone to check it out. The roster of speakers is astonishing, and what they've put together is a really interesting series of speeches. So definitely do check it out. Gentlemen, thank you again for your time. Stay safe. Thanks for your insights, and hope to speak to you soon.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.